Hello and welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're going to look at our top 2021 reads. I am going to apologize ahead of time because there are a bunch of videos that are on the horizon that are all going to apologize for the last 6 months that I haven't been uploading videos. So we're going to cut right to the chase here and get into my favorite books. Now, there are only going to be 4 books on this list, and there's 2 reasons for that. One, my reading got really derailed halfway through the year, and because of circumstances with my business, it was very difficult for me to keep up with things. The other reason why is because it wasn't a fantastic reading year for me. 2020 was absolutely phenomenal. There were so many books that I absolutely loved and I could recommend to a lot of people, and I found out that didn't happen in 2021, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I mean, I guess that's kind of what happens when you want to try to sample so many different writers from so many different places. These best books of 2021 are going to be broken down into just 2 short sections. One is going to be nonfiction, and the other one is going to be fiction, with one honorable mention thrown in there on the side. Starting with the nonfiction, we're going to kick off with Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden O'Keefe. Now, I listened to this as an audiobook. It was just a lot easier with my schedule to work in a lot more audiobooks, particularly towards the second half of the year. This was recommended to me from a friend of mine who said it was important to read, and I agreed because of the content of this. And Empire of Pain basically details and chronicles the Sackler family, who was the family responsible for Purdue Pharma, who's the company that released OxyContin. I almost wonder if I have to mind my P's and Q's when I'm talking about them, because like, if you read the book and if you know anything about that side of business, there's lots of litigation. So I'm just going to say that all of these are my opinion and just based off of what I've read from Patrick Radden O'Keefe's book, and that's it. So this is an interesting book because instead of really focusing on the details of the opioid epidemic, it actually focuses a lens on the family responsible for bringing the drug to market. And you get a real sense of the psychology, the mindset of the family. As each successive generation is born in the family, you also get the kind of diffusion of responsibility in a way. You get this kind of diffusion of ownership and kind of maybe a separation from the original members of the Sackler family. This happens all the time. I mean, for instance, if you have a family and it has something that's passed down from generation to generation, if that's shared among the family members of each generation, then that becomes increasingly difficult, right? Because it gets passed on to the brothers and sisters, and then it gets passed down to the cousins, and then once that level goes one more, then who does it go to? And it's interesting to see the mentality of the people who grew up in various circumstances. The book kind of kicks off with Arthur Sackler, who seems to be the one who spearheads a lot of the initial aspects of the family and the growth and the introduction into the pharmaceutical industry. But this happens long before OxyContin ever hits the market. The focus here is more the family. It's the family, the bringing up of, you know, their morals, their perceptions, how they handled various aspects of the company, and how they live their day-to-day lives. And then you get a real lens into the kind of personality that maybe might fit into this industry. Now, while you might want to go to a different book, something like Painkiller by Barry Meyer, which has a kind of shockingly similar cover to Empire of Pain, it's important to look at both aspects of this, because sometimes people will throw out ad hominem as a fallacy that should disregard whatever argument somebody is making. But then somebody said to me once, should I not consider the character of the person making the argument and the deception therein? And I thought that was a really good point, because deception is rife in this kind of industry. And I think this is a really important book to read, because I think a lot of us need a healthy skepticism without the cynicism. Particularly within the past 2 years, there's obviously been a lot of talk on both sides of the fence about a lot going on. I don't want to get into the weeds of that or the details of that, but anybody who reads a book like this definitely has to take pause in terms of how they regard the pharmaceutical industry. Now, again, there are other books such as Overdosed America, such as Painkiller, that are going to tell you a little bit more about the nefarious aspects of different pharmaceutical companies. But in terms of who is driving this, the character, the personality, the type of person that's required to, I guess, have both the industriousness to take this company from something that like creates foot creams to, you know, a multi-billion-dollar company that just so happens to be making his fortune off the suffering and addiction of Americans, and contrast that with the actual horror of the opioid epidemic, including, you know, I won't ruin it, but including how they managed to get away with it for the most part. The next nonfiction book is by far my favorite nonfiction book of the year, and that is How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. What the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is that it is not written from somebody who is deeply intertwined in the drug culture. Now, if you hear somebody speak about psychedelics, you might have that stereotypical impression of somebody with a tie-dye shirt, maybe white dreadlocks, maybe, you know, peace and love and all that stuff, and that's just not what you're going to get from this book. Michael Pollan is a legit journalist who has written several books, mostly about the food industry, and most recently about caffeine, which was really interesting. He was featured on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about some of the things that he found out there. So this book focuses on the history of psychedelics in America. It does a brief history of various cultures that, you know, just touching on the fact that they've been using them for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and then talks about kind of the scientific renaissance that was starting in the late 50s regarding psychedelic research. And even in the 50s, we knew that there was potential for these, you know, tools to ameliorate effects of addiction. And I'm not sure if they talked about mental health back then, because obviously it was a much different climate medically and in terms of understanding mental health, but they were definitely looking at it in terms of addiction, and they were seeing positive results. And it basically asked the question, what happened to psychedelics? How come it got demonized so much? And then it takes you through the societal history in America of the key players that were involved in bringing psychedelic research to prominence, and then kind of tarnishing the perception of psychedelics such that it had to kind of retract, pull back, go underground, and then became more of a cultural movement until the past probably maybe 10 to 20 years or so, when it slowly began resurging, probably 10, 15 years at the most. I would have to double check the timeline. It is not written in a super dry way. I really enjoyed the information in this. I enjoy how he laid it out. And it's not just a historical look. He talks about the science involved in these things and some of the scientific research and how promising it's looking as well. And I find that interesting because we're contrasting this book against Empire of Pain, where you have, you know, we put a general faith in the pharmaceutical industry. You know, this hurts, doc, give me a pill, and that's okay. But there's a lot to do with this that has place in pharmacological positive outcomes, right? Everything from coping with death for terminally ill patients to positive outcomes for various mental health issues. Even, I think there might be an argument for the recreational user, so long as it is in a guided environment. And speaking of the guided environment, one of the best parts about this book is that Michael Pollan himself is not really a drug user. I'm pretty sure he said he might have dabbled in psilocybin when he was in his late 20s, but he's in his 60s when he writes this book. I don't think he really drinks. He doesn't smoke weed. He doesn't do anything like that, but he decides to take it upon himself to thrust himself into these psychedelic experiences, and he tries 3 different psychedelics at the end. He tells you the process of what the guided experience is like, what it was like for him subjectively to go through something like that. And it's really, really interesting, the conclusions that they drew from this. I did do a review of this book along with 2 other psychedelic related books. One of those, I will say, will be my honorable mention nonfiction for the year, which was Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. If Aldous Huxley sounds familiar to you, it's because he wrote Brave New World and was actually, I'm not going to say a proponent of psychedelics, but in Doors of Perception, which is where the Doors, that the famous classic rock band, got their name from, it's similar to the end of this book where they give Aldous Huxley, I believe it was mescaline, and then Aldous Huxley basically writes out his experience, which you can write your own experience, but having Aldous Huxley write out his own experience, an author and a writer of that caliber, was really, really interesting. I should say, just so that it's clear, this is not an endorsement for people to go out and start dropping acid. You should not do that. Absolutely not. Psychedelics are not for everybody. This is just the book. Okay, this is not life advice. For the 2 fiction books, before I get into them, I will make an honorable mention for 1001 Nights, also known as 1000 Nights in One, also known as Arabian Nights. And this is, if this sounds to you like Arabian Nights, this sounds like something I watched in Aladdin. Funny you should say that. Aladdin is actually taken from 1001 Nights, which is a collection of short stories that dates back all the way to, I believe, 600 AD, and covers a general Middle Eastern collection of stories. And I thought that was really interesting, and that's why it appealed to me, because I was looking to read maybe some stories. I like very old stories because they kind of give you a window into history, but also stories from different places which give you a window into their culture. And this gives you a little bit of both. And that I found super interesting. And I think I was inspired to read this because of Salman Rushdie's masterclass on writing, where he talked about how much it inspired him. And I found several different versions of this on Audible. Some of them were for free, some of them weren't, and the productions vary wildly. So the translation that you get is going to make a big difference. And the times that the stories come out in, whether that's 600 BC or sorry, 600 AD or 1500 AD, it's going to change the style dramatically, I found. And I really enjoyed the frame story. And the frame story, long story short, is the Sultan, Shahryar, is betrayed by his wife, and as revenge he decides to bed a new woman every night and kill her before the morning. And the Grand Vizier, he has a daughter and she's the only one left, and she volunteers to go next. He pleads with her not to do it, and she decides to do it anyway because she has a plan. Her name is Scheherazade, and she has a sister named Dunyazad, and together they're the last ones to go into Sultan Shahryar's chambers. Now, before he's about to kill her in the morning, Scheherazade pleads with him and says, wait, I have a story to tell you. And she starts to tell him a story, but she doesn't finish the story by the time the sun rises. So of course he wants to kill her, but he wants to know what the end of the story is. So he decides to keep her alive until she finishes the story. But when she finishes the story, she continues with the next story. And the stories she tells are the stories in 1001 Nights, which I find super interesting. Again, I love that frame story setup. It is absolutely brilliant. And it was very inspiring for me for some of my own works. So check that one out if you want that. Again, both historical and cultural window into some different forms of storytelling. So the first major fiction book that I'm going to throw up here is, no surprise, it's the most popular review I have on this tiny, meager little channel, and that is Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. I'm not going to get into too much detail with this one because I get into a lot of detail in the first review that I did for it. Long story short, this is set in the backdrop of the Cultural Revolution in China, which I love. I love societal ties. I love historical ties into character motivations. If you have a speculative element to the story and I'm thrown into a brand new world where I have to kind of buy into that, that's cool too. But I feel like when you're doing this with real people, with real things that happen to humans that you know of, I find that hits hard, way harder every single time. And that's what I loved about this. It wasn't just a speculative fiction story for the sake of the speculative fiction. It was a speculative fiction story that branched through myriad aspects of literary analysis that I found really, really rich in terms of how you could look at this book. It is a book about making contact with aliens. It's a book that asks a lot of big questions, such as, you know, can we be trusted as stewards of the earth? Should aliens run the earth, or should we? Should we bring them here as overlords, or should we coexist with them? How do you navigate that incredibly difficult decision? And I won't give anything away because there is a lot that unfolds in this. The pacing in this isn't super fast, but if you like a little bit of an intellectual read, this is incredibly engaging and by far one of my favorite science fiction books of all time. And again, the lighting is all over because I like using natural light, but that's okay. So yeah, highly recommended. And the last book, the last fiction recommendation that I'm going to make for my favorite book of last year, my favorite fiction book by far, and I have a review coming out for this that I did record last year, but will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, and that is Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton. I am a sucker for a good coming of age story. Not necessarily a young adult story. I'm not a huge fan of young adult, but the Bildungsroman, the picaresque, the how do we navigate through the world? How do we discover who we are? What are the important questions? A lot of the important questions we ask ourselves when we are younger, and there are questions that we take for granted once we become older. And that sense of wonder is a way that you can instill some aspects of speculative fiction, I have found, without necessarily having to have a fantastical element. This has a very quirky feeling about it, juxtaposed against a very bleak familial situation, and I love that kind of juxtaposition where color can be found in some of the bleakest places. There's a lot of drug use in this, there's a lot of broken family in this, and you know, I didn't have the worst upbringing, but there's a lot that I relate to in this book. And I don't see a lot of books doing drug culture that great. I don't see a lot of books about growing up with drug culture that great. And this one really rang true with me. I have never read, I think up until this point, a book from an Australian author, which I really enjoyed. I always like sampling a brand new country. And in this book, we follow a guy named Eli Bell and his brother August, primarily Eli. And Eli is concerned mostly with the question of how to become a good man, right? There's a lot to do with male role models in this and masculinity, right? There are at least 3 different male figures that are very important to Eli Bell in this. And there is also a lot of contrast between people who society might look down upon, who are doing the best they can and might have, you know, the quote unquote cliche heart of gold, versus those who seem like white knights to society, but actually have the cliche, the skeletons in their closet, and are a lot more nefarious than we give them credit for. You might have seen the meme, some of the nicest people are covered in tattoos, and some of the biggest jerks, you know, you see on at church on Sundays. There's a lot of that in this book, and it appealed a lot to me. It is a young adult story that I feel like talks to adults as much as it does to kids, and it is written in a way that deals with the issues in a very, I'm just going to say that it's very well done. For a 40-year-old man to capture the whimsy of a young boy so effectively, but also ask big questions in the way that isn't pretentious, is very difficult to do. Very underrated skill for a writer, particularly a writer writing children. Sometimes we give them too much heightened language, and sometimes we talk down to people, and neither of that happens here. It's an absolutely fantastic book. This is my favorite personal book of the year. Was it the best book that I read of the year? I mean, if I'm thinking objectively, maybe not. Three Body Problem was very impressive. Like, from a technical standpoint, that's a very impressive book. When I read Three Body Problem, I think I'm not smart enough to write a book like this. I'm just not even close. Not even to like put together, like if you were to explain the concepts to me, I don't think I could put them together as well as he did. But when it comes to a book like this, there is just a style to it and a subject matter and a thematic thread that weaves itself through it that really hits me. This is the kind of book that speaks to me directly. It's the kind of book that I'm not going to say it's a guilty pleasure, because I have no guilt about it, but it's the flavor of book that I really like. Not since Eden Robinson's Son of a Trickster have I found a coming of age novel that has hit me so strongly. So this goes up to the very top of my stylistic favorite books with that one. And those are my 4 favorite books of the year, with my my honorable mentions as well. Let me know what you have read in the past year, what you're looking forward to reading this year, because I have a completely new stack of books and I'm super stoked to attack those now that life has become a little bit more organized. I'm looking to get back on a regular posting schedule, and I'm hoping to review a lot more interesting books this year, including starting maybe a little bit more of a video essay format, which I've always wanted to do ever since I first saw CGP Grey like 10 years ago. So hopefully we can get to that point. Sorry for the hiatus. I will do my best not to let that happen again, and I will see you guys on the next video. Os.